Well, hello. What do we have here? This is the diagnostic writing test usually given on the first day of class. There are 22 questions in the first part. Let's have a look at that. What you're supposed to do here is continue the sentence that started in the left column. So, well, the left column shows what we call time phrases, and in the right column, you have to put a sentence. Well, guess what? I've got a correction key for you here. Suggested corrections and loads of comments. Well, let's have a look. Within a week of restarting classes, that was the first time clause that you had to use. Notice starting classes, her starting classes. This is a complex gerundive phrase where the possessive pronoun her stands for the understood subject of starting classes. In other words, within a week of her starting classes might mean something like within a week of the day when she started taking classes. But instead of a full clause like that with a conjugated verb, we do this a lot in English. Just use the corresponding gerundive clause, and if you need to make it clear, to clarify who the understood subject is, you put the possessive pronoun. Well, all right, so within a week of her starting classes, since there's no tense, no particular time specified by this time clause, you can put all kinds of things. Past, non-past, imminent future, remote future. So let me see. What does that mean? That means that, you can stop the clip and read this if you like, but it means in essence that you could have these. Within a week of her starting classes, she made or had made friends with all her new classmates. Now that's specific. That's a specific event. It actually happened, and it's a single identifiable situation or event. But here, you see, you could also have the generic. Within a week of her starting classes, she usually, or she always, makes friends with all her new classmates. By the way, in this case, the her could drop because it's clear, pretty clear who's starting classes. So you see, these examples here show that the time phrase within a week of her starting classes is ambiguous between introducing a generic statement or a specific one. Also, it's ambiguous between discussion of a past finished event or one that's expected in the near or remote future. I'll send you this document. You can have a look at it. Look at the second one. In the week she started classes. This is the time phrase headed by in instead of with him. And you notice that the verb in the time phrase is in the simple past. That really forces the sentence to be limited to a description of something in the past. So in the week she started classes, she befriended a fellow, meaning she made friends with somebody. In the week she started classes, she had befriended this fellow who agreed to teach her how to make waffles. Apologies to all of our Belgian friends out there. I have no idea whether Belgians have any special affiliation cultural or otherwise. With waffle making, it's just a stereotype, and this is just a silly example sentence. In the week she started classes, she had befriended someone who agreed. Notice how this works. In the sentence, you have two clauses. She had befriended someone who agreed to teach her. And each clause has its own verb. Notice what happened first and what happened second. First, they made friends, and secondly, they agreed to something. In other words, the first event or situation is the background. And the second one is the main idea. Now, in English, we do this all the time. We'll have what we could call a complex sentence because it has two clauses in it. And one clause will have a verb in the compound tense, and the other will have a verb in the simple tense. And to us, to our ears, to our brains, I guess, the compound clause, the clause with the compound verb always sounds like the background, or it refers to the first thing that happened chronologically, or the first thing that started chronologically, and which usually serves as an explanation or a background with which you can understand the second thing. This is very, very common. Look at number 3. For a week after she starts, well, there are two possibilities. There can be a generic meaning, or there can be a specific one. The generic meaning, for a week after she starts classes, she usually focuses on making new friends. Remember that we often use the so-called simple present to refer to things that are generally true. But it could also be followed, it also could be compatible with the so-called will future, which is specific. Well, it could be will, or it could be any of the other modals, which usually forces a specific reading. So for a week after she starts, meaning, let's say, this semester, she will focus on making new friends. Similarly with the going to future. Now let's look at something up here. Notice this. This is a time phrase. For a week after she starts. And in this time phrase, we're using the so-called simple present, which is ambiguous here. When it appears in the time phrase, it's ambiguous. The reason it's ambiguous is because we cannot have this. You cannot have for a week after she will start classes. This is impossible. You cannot have this. No modals, well, generally, I think there may be exceptions, but generally there are no modals in a time phrase, which is different from French. French can have your futur simple inside the time phrase. We cannot have the will future or a future constructed with modals in the time phrase. That's why we have this ambiguity. The time phrase for a week after she starts can be compatible with a general statement, she usually focuses, or a specific statement, she will focus. This asterisk is used conventionally in the linguistic and in the language learning literature to indicate a form that's for some reason or another, which is for some reason or another unacceptable in language. Wrong conjugation, wrong meaning, anything like that. We put the asterisk before that form. Let's look at number 4. Number 4. For a week before she starts classes, and we have the same ambiguity. You can't say for a week before she will start classes. You can't do that. So it's ambiguous between the generic meaning and the specific meaning. Try number 5. By the time she starts classes. Well, we need to talk about what this means. By time X. That's not always easy to grasp because there usually are not exact. There usually is not an exact translation into any other language for this particular time phrase. By time X. In this case, by the time she starts classes. Well, as before, we have this ambiguity because we cannot say by the time she will start classes. That doesn't exist. So we have this ambiguity between generic statements and specific ones. Let's talk about the meaning of by time X. I have some silly examples here. Let's see now. By the time my silly sister turns 60, she will be living in Cape Breton. That means that before she turns 60, she will already be living in Cape Breton. And by time X also adds an idea, something like this, something like no later than time X. That's one way of explaining it. So by the time my silly sister turns 60, she will own her own house, meaning she will already have her own house. She won't wait until she's 60. It'll happen before that. By the time my silly sister turns 60, her diabetes will have started to affect her heart. Her heart will not stay healthy until she's 60. It will start being affected at some time before. By the time my silly sister turns 60, she will probably have at least 7 grandchildren. She will have been studying Danish for 4 decades, probably without learning it. So that's in the imminent or remote future. How about something in the past? Suppose my sister were already over 60 years of age. Well, she isn't, but let's just suppose. By the time my silly sister turned 60, she was living, or she was already living, in Cape Breton. By the time my silly sister turned 60, she owned her own house. Her diabetes had started to affect her heart. She had 7 grandchildren. She had sold off her old Chevy, and she had been making her own yogurt for most of her life. How is this special? Why not just say before she turned 60? Well, by time X means something including the meaning of before time X, but it has more meaning than that. It's loaded, semantically more loaded than that. By time X is looking back from that time point, the way you look back from a vantage point. In other words, by phrases are retrospective. They look back from that point, from time point X. And usually you look back at everything that you have accomplished or accumulated or failed to accomplish or failed to accumulate. But you're looking back, on dirait comme faire le bilan, having a retrospective. That's what it is. So since this thing that occurred in the main sentence comes before time point X in the by phrase, by time X, we like to have here For example, the past perfect. We like to have compound conjugations. Was living, that's past, past progressive. Had started, past perfect. Had 7 grandchildren is a stative. In other words, as is the case with the compound conjugations, the stative conjugation refers to a situation or a pre-existing state, something that was established before time point X. So by the time my silly sister turned 60, she'd been making her own yogurt for most of her life. We have many more examples of this coming in other exercises, and I'm sure you'll get the idea pretty quickly. Number 6, by the time she started classes, she had new friends. There's your stative. She had made new friends. Okay, that's your past perfect. But how about this? By the time she started classes, she made new friends. Actually, for me, that's impossible. The question mark before a form means that it's difficult to accept without a strong supporting context, without robust contextual support. And the asterisk means that it's just plain wrong. So if I put this before a form, that means that for some people, at certain times, this form is acceptable, but with restrictions. Whilst for other people, it's never acceptable. In this case, for me, it's impossible. I can't do it. By the time she started classes, she made new friends. No, I can't do it. I can't do it. I need a compound conjugation like the past perfect or the past progressive or the past perfect progressive or a stative. She had new friends, which somehow indicates that from time point X, you're looking back at something that happened before or was established before or was already or had already started happening before. By the time she started classes, she lived in the dormitory. Possible. I think I could say that one. Impossible here, because make new friends, that's punctual. I need the emphasis. I need to know that this thing, making new friends, came clearly before she started classes. Those are 2 points, right? Lived. She lived in the dormitory. Oh, I don't know. It's touchy. I would prefer this. She was living in the dormitory by the time she started classes. Well, let's look at number 7. After she has started classes, pay close attention to this. Make sure to take note of this so that you know that you're in the non-past. After she has started classes, or after she starts classes, these are both possible, and you get the same ambiguity as before. It could be a generic statement. She usually has time to make friends, generally, usually, or it could be a specific statement, a specific event or situation expressed with a modal, such as will. So that's an ambiguity that we already know about. We know that that ambiguity is there because time phrases cannot they cannot host a modal. So that leaves open that ambiguity. But now there's another ambiguity that I want to show you here. It's not really an ambiguity. It's actually pretty important. These are not fine points. This is the normal use of the verb in English. So don't be intimidated. This is actually quite basic. Why do we have both possibilities, both variations or variants for the time phrase? Well, after she starts class, that means that there's a point. Before that point, there are no classes. And after that point, there are classes. So there's a point at which the classes start. Well, you can emphasize that by using the present perfect instead of the simple present. I have to talk to you about this. What does this do? Why do we have the verb has here? And what meaning does it add? Well, I can answer that very briefly. There's a time when you have something, and a time before that when you don't. Okay, so I have what is this over here? I have a harp. Yeah, I have a harp. Ouch. Well, I didn't always have that harp. There's a time before I had it. And there was a point at which I became the owner of this harp. Didn't have it before that point. And then I had it after that point. In the verbal system, the conjugations has started. Well, starting classes is something that you can consider as a thing that you have. You can consider it similar to an object in this sense. So once she has started classes, that means that she has this acquired. Starting classes is done. You can't take it away from her. She didn't have it before, but now it's something that she has. It's like an experience, you could say. You can't take away someone's experiences. So after she has started classes, emphasizes the fact that that point has been passed. So you see here, after she has started classes, let's take the specific one, okay? After she has started classes, she will probably have time to make new friends. This emphasizes the idea of getting the beginning of classes out of the way. So start classes, when that's done and out of the way, then go make friends. You don't have to do that. You don't have to emphasize it things in that way. You can leave it for interpretation. But we like doing this sometimes. After she has started classes, usually she has time to make new friends. Usually she waits until that point is passed. Classes have started, and then she's free to go and make friends. Well, we have something similar in the past. After she started classes versus after she had started classes. And it really is the same idea, with perhaps one thing more. After she had started classes, she did things. Well, remember that arrangement. Compound verb, simple tense. The compound verb expresses the thing that happened first, or emphasizes the fact that that thing happened first. It was the necessary background, the necessary condition for the second thing to happen. So after she had started classes, then she realized how little time she would have for her silly Facebook friends. After she had started classes, her silly Facebook friends began to bully her. Okay, so you see, background, classes starting. Main idea, Facebook friends bothering her. Background, foreground. Or we could also call it the figure and the ground. The ground is the background or the contextual basis. Yes, well, you can look at these examples, and I'm sure that you will discover some things, some little things here and there that are not perfectly well explained in the way that I just proposed. You just bring those questions to me and we'll talk about them. I think you'll see that overall, it's a very simple system. The conjugational system of English and its relationship with the time clauses is really a very, very simple thing. Different from French, though. Let's look at number 9. As she was starting classes, remember that as refers to simultaneity. So it suggests that the situation referred to in the time clause was simultaneous with the situation described in the main clause. Notice that it tends to be specific, that specific semester. It can be, but usually is not used. It's not as easy to use with generalizations, like most semesters or every semester or something like that. That's more difficult. Possible. You see the question mark? That means it's possible with robust contextual support, but it's not as typical, not as usual. Let's look at the example answers. As she was starting classes, she began to receive all kinds of messages. All right. As she was starting classes, her friends were discussing names for Smiley Virus's new toy poodle. Well, that's silly enough to be true. What about this here? As she was starting classes, her silly friends discussed names for Smiley Virus's new poodle. Well, this is possible. It is slightly unusual without robust contextual support. This is definitely better. Now you can see why, because this here is the past progressive, as is this here, past progressive. So this is an instance of what we would call parallel structure. The brain, the language parts of your brain are very fond of parallel structure. They like that. Was starting, we're discussing. She was starting, they were discussing. Very, very pleasing to the brain. It's processed more rapidly. But this is not impossible. All right. Let's have a quick look at the following. Number 10. Just as she is starting classes, rather than as, we have just as. That adds a meaning. It's very similar. The as suggests simultaneity, and the just as signals something like fortuitous, unexpected simultaneity, like a coincidence that's too good, or you could say too bad to be true. Let's look at the example. Just as she is starting classes, and let's take the generic meaning first, every year. Just as she's starting classes, there's always some kind of last-minute family crisis. Exactly when she's starting classes, there's a crisis at home. That's the meaning of just as. It could also be specific. Just as she is starting classes, meaning this year, just as she's starting classes, something will happen. You watch, you'll see, it never fails. I'll let you look at that example more closely and see if you can invent your own. 11. Right up until she started classes. You know something? There's a design mistake in this exercise. We really should start with number 12. because you've got until clauses, and then you have right up until clauses, which mean something very similar, but you get an extra meaning with right up. So let's start with number 12. Until she starts classes. What does this word mean, until? Until time X implies that the sentence will describe a situation which is constant up to and including time point X. That's the meaning of until. It is something like jusqu'à, but I wouldn't say it's identical. You better look at it for its own sake and try to figure out how it's used and what it means. Until she starts classes, that could be, like as with the other cases, that could be generic or specific. So there could be a general statement following, or there could be a very specific statement following. So you have examples of both. Until she starts classes, she usually focuses on making new friends. And she ignores Facebook. Good for her, okay. Until she starts classes. That's what she does. Up to that point, when classes start, she focuses on making new friends. That's what she always does. General statement. Until she starts classes, she will focus on making new friends. That's what she intends to do this semester. She will focus on making new friends. That will continue. And then, at some point, she'll start classes. Time point X in the expression until time point X usually refers to the point in time at which the previous situation changes or can change. Let's look at this. Here's a simple example. She waited patiently until 3 o'clock for her novio to call. Well, that means, or that implies very strongly, that at 3 o'clock, or before 3 o'clock, or sometime before, at 3 o'clock, she's expecting her novio to call. And the constant situation, the unchanging situation up to that point, is her waiting. Then at 3 o'clock, there's a time point there. Until 3 o'clock, that time point X, either she stops waiting or she reconsiders it and maybe continues to wait. Both are possible. She waited patiently until 3 o'clock for a novio to call, and then she got fed up and left. That's one possible answer. Let's put it down here. Or, and at 3, she decided to give him another hour. Okay, so until time point X doesn't say that the change necessarily happens at time point X, but there's this potential or this expectation. So let's go back to number 11. Right up until she started classes. Well, notice first the time phrase has a verb in the simple past, so you know the sentence is being framed in the past finished period. Don't overlook that. Do not overlook this. Okay. Now, what does this add? Right up until. This simply adds the emphasis. It emphasizes that the continuation of the situation was up to and including, literally including, up to and including time point X. Right up to that point. So right up until she started classes, she kept responding to all those people online, or she responded. She responded or she kept responding. this kept responding, this word here, emphasizes the continuation, or the perseverance, if you like. All right, let's look at number 13. Now we're getting somewhere. This is interesting. This word here does not accurately translate the word the word depuis in French, or después, desde in Spanish. It does not. That is to say that those Spanish and French words can include the meaning of English since, but English since does not, the meaning of since is limited. It does not mean all of the things that the French or the Spanish words can mean. Since indicates, as you can see with the verb, since indicates the end of the previous time period and the beginning of the current one. So that's why the sentence that comes with the time phrase, like a since phrase, must be in the present. Must be in the present. Let's call it, we're calling it the present, but let's call it the non-past, no modal. Okay, that's what you usually call, that's what we now usually call what used to be called the simple present. Not the simple present, but the present. We'll come back to the choice of conjugations in a moment. Since she started classes, non-past, no modal, and what else? There must be something with have. There must be. Have plus a participle. In other words, you must have one of the perfect tenses. So let's have a look at it. Since she started classes, she's had no time for those ninnies on Facebook. Since she started classes, she has told her silly online friends that she's too busy. There's another perfect. There's the perfect progressive. So she has had no time and she has been turning off her phone. Those are the only conjugations possible. The only conjugations that are compatible with the since phrase. Let's look at the conjugation table again. Here's the conjugation table, which we always discuss in the first class. Notice how this works. The since phrase forces a present, in other words, a non-past interpretation, and the modals are excluded. You can't have those. So that leaves only these here. But remember what I said a little earlier about the meaning of have. This conjugation here, that's the perfect, the non-past, no modal perfect. And this one here, this is the non-past, no modal, perfect progressive. Let's emphasize this. Okay, here it goes. What do these conjugations have that's special? And why are they compatible? Why are they the only ones compatible with the since phrase? Well, remember that the since phrase marks the beginning of the current period. So that explains why it has to be non-past. But why must it have have? Why must you have a perfect or perfect progressive? Simple. If you have a beginning point of the current period, you want a conjugation that's compatible with that. Simple present is not compatible because it's a general statement. So since she started classes, she has no time. That is a serious mistake. She has no time is a general statement. No beginning, no end to the situation that you're referring to. She has no time. But since she started classes indicates the beginning point. At one point, she was not doing classes, and then right after that point, she was doing classes. That's what it means to start, right? And there's a beginning point that's clear. And the end point is open because we're in the current period, or the present, as you might call it. Now, have, you see? They contribute that element of meaning. So she has told her friends. Okay, at one point, she did not speak with him, had not spoken with him. Speaking had not occurred. That experience had not occurred. And then the next moment, it was acquired. She had it. And there are two of these, the ordinary perfect and the perfect progressive. The generic is incompatible with the since phrase. How about the progressive? Not perfect progressive, just progressive. Well, the progressive also lacks a beginning point. So it's also in contradiction. If I were to say, since she started classes, she is telling her friends that she doesn't have time for them anymore. Well, that's incompatible. There's a incoherence there, a contradiction even, you could say. Since she started, there's a beginning point. She is telling her friends. That's a conjugation that emphasizes the inside, if you like, of the event or the situation, with no reference to beginning or end points. So those are incoherent. Since she started classes, she tells her friends that she has no time. That's incoherent. Since she started classes, she is telling her friends that she has no time for them. That's also incompatible. Since she started classes, from that point, she has told her friends. There's a beginning point there. First time she told them, second time she told them. Or, since she started classes, she has been telling them. In other words, at one point, she began doing this. She acquired this, the act of telling her friends that she didn't have time for them. Well, that's enough of that. You can look at these examples. There's just one more thing I want to say about them. What is this? Event counting. And what is this? Event sizing. Well, these are just fancy ways of referring to the fact that you can count instances of an event or even of a situation, but you cannot count a situation per se. Whenever you have ing in the conjugation, there's a reference to a situation, not to an event or the instance of an event that you can count. So let's look at this quickly. Let's put it down here like this. Since she started classes, she has told her friends 3 times, several times, once, twice, 3 times. She has told them this. She has told them once, she has told them twice. So that is event counting. And the event counting words are these: 3 times, several times, and so on like that. You could also look at the same event from a different point of view. You could think of it as a situation, something that you don't count as an occurrence once, twice, 3 times. And in that case, you could emphasize this point of view by using quantifiers that don't count, but they simply size. So instead of counting events once, twice, thrice, 3 times, several times, you give the size of the event, or the regularity or the intensity of the event. So since she started classes, she has told her silly friends constantly, or from time to time, or occasionally, that she's too busy to join them. Right. And there are more examples here of event sizing versus event counting. Let's see now. Since 1990, I've been a teacher here. Since I moved here, present perfect. Since I moved here, I've had peanut butter for breakfast every day of the week. Since I moved here, I have been watching weird shows on YouTube. Sure enough. How about this? I had trouble with rowdy neighbors. Since I moved here, I had trouble with rowdy neighbors. That's impossible. Because had trouble, you had trouble. You experienced trouble in the finished past. But remember, the since phrase refers to the beginning of the current period. Now you could have after I moved here, I had trouble. After I had moved here, I had trouble. Okay, we've talked about the logic there of those examples. Let's look at something more. Remember before we were saying that possession has a starting point. Before you had your headache, you didn't have a headache. Before you made your new friend, you didn't have that new friend. And before you bought that old car, you didn't have it. You were not the owner. Before a certain point, you were not the patient. Before a certain point, you were not the friend. Before a certain point, you were not the owner. So there is a point at which you became the patient, you became the new friend, and you became the owner of that car. So similarly, when you have conjugations that include have, there's a point. There's a point where it starts. All right, let's skip past this quickly. I encourage you to look at these sentences here and think about them, and think about why sometimes these time phrases of frequency are permitted or not permitted. Well, since has another function that you need to know. Sometimes you have to ask yourself whether since really is a time word or is in fact a marker of causality. In that case, you could say that since is a synonym of because or as or for. In French, if you had to translate it, if you had to translate the sense of causality you might think of puisque or car. So, since she's starting classes, meaning considering the fact that she's starting classes, we cannot reasonably expect her to take care of her grandmother. Number 15. Here we've got since. And, sorry, we have ever since. Ever since is an intensified form of the time word since. So ever since, not just since, but in all the time since. All the time since she started taking classes. In all the time since she started taking classes, she has asked constantly for help. Ever since she started taking classes, she has been asking for help. Notice something? Ever since is only compatible with event sizing and not with event counting. I think you already know what I mean. You just don't know it in those terms. So let's look at it here. Ever since she started taking classes, she has been asking constantly. She has been asking 3 times for help. That's impossible. This is event counting. And this conjugation, as well as this time word here, whoops, what have I done? This time word here, are inconsistent with event counting, but they're perfectly consistent with event sizing. So ever since she started taking classes, she has asked constantly for help. She has been asking constantly for help. 16. While she takes evening classes. Well, you know that the word while is a marker of simultaneity, similarly to as. It can also be a marker of contrast. But let's look at this first. Let's first look at while as a marker of simultaneity. In other words, while as a time phrase marker. Okay, so while she takes evening classes, her elderly grandmother will stir the goulash and pray that she makes it home safely. Okay, those are specific meanings. Let's look at the question I was just referring to. Oh dear. Why does it do that? Oh, there we go. Okay, so while her grandmother is fond of old TV shows, she enjoys smiley virus tubes. Sorry, we call them clips usually. There you see. Why can't I get that right? Oh well, you get the idea, don't you? In other words, while also refers to simultaneity of a kind, but a different kind. Let's try this. She watches smiley virus clips in the other room. Okay, let's look at this and analyze it, compare it properly. Good. So here, while indicates chronological simultaneity. Literally, at the same time, when her grandmother's watching old TV shows, she's there watching smiley virus clips in the other room. That's literal chronological simultaneity. The same word while is used to indicate another kind of simultaneity, a kind of contrast of things that are both true at the same time and which are somehow in contrast with each other. So on the one hand, her grandmother is fond of old TV shows. On the other hand, she enjoys, not the grandmother, but whoever we're talking about, she enjoys smiley virus. So this sentence here does not imply that grandmother and the person we're discussing are actually watching their respective shows at the same time. While this one does. In fact, it says so explicitly. Oh my, what have we got here? Once, oh, okay, 17 and 18. I have students telling me that they don't even see any difference between 17 and 18. They tell me, teacher, you repeated a sentence once she started classes. Once she started classes. Obviously, it's not the same at all. Once she started classes means when at last classes had started. That's what it means. On the other hand, once she started classes means once upon a time it happened that she started classes and something happened. That's totally different. Let's look at the examples. Once she started classes, she found time to make friends. Once she had started classes, remember the little difference, little tiny meaning difference? Once that was done out of the way, classes were started, she found time to make friends. It could be the same sentence. It could be the same sentence. But there is a difference in emphasis on the relationship between the event referenced in the time clause and that described in the main clause. So once she started classes, and I might put a comma here depending on what follows. Once she started classes only to realize that there would be no time for friends. Okay, so she started classes, and what good did that do? Well, then she suddenly realized, I'll have no time for my friends anymore. So I have it both ways here. Once she started classes only to realize that there'd be no time for friends. Once she started classes and realized that there would be no time for friends. Well, 19, we're almost done here. How do we contrast but, however, and nevertheless? These are three different things. You mustn't mix them up. She took the class and passed, but took it over to improve her GPA, her grade point average. Notice that we have but connecting two clauses, not sentences, clauses. Clauses, not independent sentences. So this here is a compound sentence. It's a compound sentence because it is compounded or composed of two clauses, two very ordinary clauses. She took the class, she took the class over. She took the class in past, but she took the class over to improve her GPA. That is one sentence, two clauses, in this case, compounding, because the two clauses are on the same level of syntactic importance, and they're connected with this here, but. This is why we English teachers always say, do not start a sentence with but, at least not in academic or professional English. Don't do that. The Journal de Québec can do that, and the Montreal Gazette can do that, but you mustn't imitate that. You must not do that. So it indicates contrast. On the one hand, she took the class and passed, but on the other hand, unexpectedly, but there's a contrast, she took it over to improve her GPA. Now, however, means pretty much the same thing. The difference is that however is used to start an independent sentence rather than another clause. So you can have the same idea, exactly the same idea. She took the class and passed, but took it over to improve her GPA. She took her class and passed, period. However, she decided to take it over to save her GPA. Look at number 21. How is nevertheless different from however? Many of my students were starting to write paragraphs and complex sentences, well, complex descriptions and discussions, do not know the difference between however and nevertheless. You can look it up on your own, but I'll offer you some hints. Notice that she took the class and passed, however, she decided to take it over. So there's a kind of unexpected contrast, which is added there. Number 21, she took the class and passed. Nevertheless, she took it over, even though her GPA was a respectable 3.8. Now here, 20. She took the class and passed and decided to take it over to save her GPA. Well, that's a contrast in the sense that on the one hand she passed, and even so she took it again. But the contrast is not outrageous or difficult to accept, nor is it totally unpredictable. With nevertheless, you have those stronger ideas. She took the class and passed. Nevertheless, or you could say, even so, or all the same, she took it over, even though her GPA was fine. Or how about this? She took the class and passed. Nevertheless, she had to take it over for a better grade. Why? Because, or as, the school of her dreams would only consider candidates with a 4.0 GPA. So that should explain or should give you some insights into the uses of but, however, and nevertheless. Let's look at the last one here. Well, this is interesting. Upon her taking the class, he. Okay, let's look at this first. Suppose we are lacking the possessive pronoun her. Upon taking the class, he immediately notified everybody on Facebook. All right, let's just suppose for the moment that that's our example right here. Well, there's a problem If you remove this, upon taking the class, he immediately notified everybody on Facebook. That means that he was taking the class, and then he went and notified everybody. If you want the subject or the understood subject of the gerundive clause to be different from the subject of the main clause, you have no choice in English. You have to add this here. You have no choice. Now, what does this mean, upon? Upon means something like on, with a bit more emphasis, if you like. And upon is used for other things than spatial relationships. For example, the computer may be on the table. It's unusual to say the computer is upon the table. That's very unusual. But we do say upon for spatial things in other contexts. High up upon the mountaintop sits the guru. Well, that's spatial. There's the mountaintop, and there he is sitting up there on the mountaintop. So we can use upon for some spatial things, but not for ordinary ones. That's strange. But we do use upon, in ordinary speech, we do use upon to refer to things in time. So when you say upon her taking the class, it means as soon as it was done and established that she was taking that class, he immediately notified everybody. And this word upon is usually consistent and compatible with the idea of immediately. Aussitôt que, as soon as she started the class, or when she started the class, but right away. Upon her taking the class, he notified everybody. One last sentence that we should compare. Upon her taking the class, he deposited money in her account for the tuition fees. Compare with this. She took the class. He thereupon deposited money for tuition in her account. Thereupon. And upon. So thereupon means at that moment, right away, straight away from that moment when the thing happened.